Hi, everybody. Today I am going to introduce you to the novel that we are going to begin reading this week called The Outsiders. And if you can hear the excitement in my voice, if you could see my face, you would know that this is by far one of my all-time favorite pieces of literature to teach. It is a great piece of literature. My students usually love it. It historically, through the course of time, has been a very popular piece of literature. Your parents probably even read it when they were your age, and my guess is that they probably loved it too. This is what you call your classic coming of age kind of novel, where it talks about things that even though the story was set all the way back in the 1960s, I promise you there are things happening in this story that you're going to relate to. So without further ado, let's jump right in. And today is all about just giving you some background information about the book, introducing you to some of the characters and some of the things that you can expect as we make our way through this novel. So without further ado, here is some information about S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders. So we're going to begin with an anticipation guide. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to think about your own personal answer to those questions or your own personal experience revolving around those questions. Now, if we were together, we would be doing this activity much differently. But for our purposes today, we're going to call this activity stand up, sit down, fight, fight, fight. And while you're not at all going to be fighting, I put that in there because in the book, there's an awful lot of fighting. But I do want you to actually physically get up and move as you think about some of these questions. And while that might seem a little bit weird because maybe you're listening to this recording right now alone, I would actually encourage you to go out and find some people, maybe your family members, a brother, a sister, mom, dad, and have them do this activity with you, because it's always kind of interesting to think about some of the questions I'm going to ask, and you can see the movement of other people and kind of compare it with your own movement, okay? So I do expect you, when I ask these questions, if you agree with the question, if your answer would be yes, then you should physically stand up. If you disagree with the question and your answer would be no, then you should physically sit down. And I do want you to kind of think about and keep track of how many times are you standing up and how many times are you sitting down. And if you're doing this with someone, pay attention to their movement too. Here we go. Ready? Do you like to listen to music or go to the movies? Are you the oldest child in your family? Are you the youngest child in your family? Are you a middle child in your family? Does our school have cliques? Are you a member of a clique? Is it possible to move from clique to clique to clique? Do you think money equals status? Have you ever fought with your parents? Have you ever fought with your siblings? Okay, take a moment right now and think about those 10 questions and kind of get a feel for how many times did you stand up and how many times did you sit down. And if you are doing this with someone else, think about the amount of their movement as well. We've got 10 more questions coming your way. Here we go. Same rules apply. Would you do anything to protect your family? Do you think loyalty is the thread that holds friendship together? Do you have friends who are like family? Do you have friends your parents don't approve of? Are you the friend your friends' parents don't approve of? Would you hang out all night at a park with a friend? Would you sit and watch the sunset with a friend? Would you help a friend who was in trouble? Would you help a friend who had committed a crime? Is violence sometimes necessary to resolve conflict? All right, think about those 10 questions and your movement from within. How many times did you stand up? How many times did you sit down? But also start noticing the trend in some of these questions. The first set of questions, a lot of them had to do with family. The second set of questions, a lot of them have to do with friends and friendship. Are you sensing a theme, maybe? One more set of questions. Here we go. Can people from different economic classes be friends? Would you stand up for what is right, even if everyone else is sitting down? Have you ever thought about your future? Do your future plans include children? Would you ever give your children weird names like Ponyboy or Soda Pop? Would you ever write a story about your life? Have you ever felt like an outsider? Have you ever treated someone else like an outsider? Have you ever read a book and loved it? And roughly, did you stand up at least twice during the course of this activity? Okay, so that concludes our anticipation activity. But what I want you to understand, and again, if we were here together, we would talk about a lot of these questions. But what I want you to understand right now is that if you stood up at least once to any of these questions, if you agreed with any of these questions, then when we read the novel The Outsiders, there's going to be something in it for you. All of the things that I just asked you about are things relevant to the story. And so you're going to be able to connect to it. You're going to be able to relate to it. Even though the time period is going to be significantly different, there are still things in it that we can connect to. And that's one of the reasons why this has become one of the most beloved books in the history of all American literature. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that book. The book is called The Outsiders. You should by now have your very own personal copy of that book. But what I wanted to share with you is some of the various covers that have graced the top of this book over the last 50 or some odd years. Take a look at each of the different covers that I've presented to you here and think about what the cover might indicate about what's going to happen in the story. And then is there any one particular cover that is more appealing to you, and why might that be? Obviously, the one in the middle is generally the version of the book that my students purchase, but maybe you got your hands on a different version of the book. Is it a different cover than the one even posted here? Is there one that you think is more interesting than others? It's always a good idea to look at the cover of the book. Okay? Next, let's talk about the author. In order to understand why The Outsiders is so great, you have to know a little bit about the author, S.E. Hinton. So I'm going to walk you through some facts about the author's life right now. S.E. Hinton was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1948. As a young child, Hinton was an avid reader and would spend hours writing stories. Hinton wanted to create stories about the truth of teenagers. There was no sugarcoating involved. Hinton wanted to write stories that were realistic, stories about what was being seen in the life that was being lived in that moment. And so that's what Hinton ultimately strived to do. The Outsiders was written while Hinton was in high school, and during the graduation ceremony, Hinton was offered a publication contract by the age of 16. The age of 16, did y'all hear that? The first edition of The Outsiders was published on bookshelves around the country. Don't tell me that you guys can't write great things. Teenagers can write great things. Hinton proves that. Hinton went on to attend the University of Tulsa and earned a Bachelor of Science in Education. David Inhofe became a major influence in Hinton's life and became kind of the inspiration for writing the next novel that Hinton wrote, which was called That Was Then and This Is Now. Okay. There are a few additional books in Hinton's repertoire. Our library generally has most of these books, so if you end up liking The Outsiders, you may want to check out some of these other books, Tex, Rumblefish, Taming the Star Runner. But in 1990, Hinton shifted focus and began writing primarily children's picture books. Okay, now let's talk about The Outsiders as a whole, all right? The Outsiders was inspired by real-life events. Again, I said Hinton saw that things were happening to teenagers that people weren't writing about. And so she wanted to write about real-life events happening in and around Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is considered to be the first realistic adult nonfiction book, but it is important that you understand it is fiction. This story is not true. It might be based on people that Hinton knew or witnessed or grew up around, but it is a fictional novel, but it is very much realistic fiction, okay? All right, let's take a look at The Outsiders at a glance. And what I mean by that are the narrative elements, things like character, setting, plot, and theme. Let's talk first of all about the characters. The characters in this story are basically divided into two groups. You have the kids who are called the greasers. Those are the poor kids from the east side. And then the rich kids from the west side are called the Socs. Now notice the pronunciation of that word. It is Soch. Soft C sound. A lot of people want to read the book and say the greasers and the socks. Nope, it's the greasers and the Socs because it's short for socials. The main character of the story is a boy named Ponyboy. Ponyboy is the narrator of the story. He tells the story from first person point of view. He has two brothers, Derry and Soda Pop, and then his group of friends, Dally, Johnny, Two-Bit, and Steve. They make up the Greaser Gang. The rival gang consists of primarily Bob and Randy, but then there's also this girl named Cherry Valance who plays a really crucial role in the story, and we'll find out more about her later. Okay? As we talked about already, the setting is in the Southwest, most likely Oklahoma. It does take place in the 1960s, so you're going to need to pay attention to things like the music they listen to, the cars they drive, the clothes, the way they style their hair. And you also want to pay attention to how that social and economical diversity creates a mood of turmoil and chaos. The plot, there's a whole lot of conflict happening in this plot. And primarily it's a lot of person versus person, but there is also person versus self when Ponyboy starts asking things about his own internal conflicts, things like that. And then lastly, we have a lot of universal themes happening in this story. This notion of don't judge people based on their appearance or social class, violence, is it ever really necessary, loyalty among family and friends, the role friends play in your family life, and it's important to be yourself, sticking to who you are at the heart of things, the core of your being, okay? This book, as I mentioned, is historically based. It's realistically based. But even though Hinton never really directly refers to specific historical or political events, it does seek to raise awareness about some things happening in this country in the 1960s. The 1960s were a time of great social divide, and young people were attempting to find their voices, raise their voices, and inspire change. You also had in the 1960s things like the civil rights movement happening and people drawing attention to the discrimination against African Americans. And so the setting of this story really does kind of epitomize some of that social turmoil that was going on in that time period. Because it's set in the 60s, you're going to hear the characters use some terminology that we may not be familiar with in 2020. So, for example, when you hear them talk about the fuzz, they're referring to the police. When you hear them use the word heater, they're talking about a gun. When you hear them use the word broad, they're referring to a woman. And when you hear them say things like, oh, he was really hacked off, that actually means that they were really angry. And a few more 1960s terminology, like groovy, you're going to hear them mention things like juvie or JD. That would be a juvenile delinquent. You will hear them talk about the cooler, and they're referring to jail. You're going to hear them talk about something called a rumble, and that is a fight. And you're going to hear them talking about getting really pickled, and what they mean is that they're getting drunk. In addition to some of those 60s terms, there are a lot of literary terms that I want you to focus on as we read this book. And again, I said it from the outset, I love teaching this book. Why? Because it's great story, relatable content, kids love it, but it is also great literature. S.E. Hinton blows it out of the water here with the ability to pull in some of these really cool literary features. And the fact that it was done when the writer was only 16 years old makes it all that much more impressive. So what are some of those key literary terms that I'm going to have you look for as we begin reading this story? Well, there's something called symbolism. We talk about symbolism a lot in my class. It is when a tangible, touchable object is meant to represent something far more abstract. Okay, the best example of symbolism that I like to use is always like the American flag. At its most basic level, that's a piece of fabric, right? It's a tangible, touchable piece of fabric. But at the heart and soul of that flag is the symbolic meaning of patriotism and sacrifice and the military and things like that. Okay? Another literary term that we talk about is the term allusion. Allusion is when an author will make reference to historical events, common knowledge events that most readers should have some sort of connection to. They might be referencing things in mythology or history or pop culture or religion or other pieces of literature. But when they make that reference, the expectation is that the reader is going to have some sort of prior knowledge of it and be able to make the connection. We see in this story a really cool use of flashback. Flashback is when there is a time jump, when something happens in the story and then all of a sudden the narrator takes a break and goes back in time and tells a prior event that was significant and important to give you some additional background knowledge. And then you also have the key term of foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when the author leaves you little hints or clues about things that will happen later. Okay, and I apologize. I don't mean any spoiler alert with my image there for foreshadowing, any of you Star Wars fans out there. But that's a great example of foreshadowing, when you leave little nuggets, little bits of information early in the story, and then you get to a point later and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they actually kind of hinted at that so much earlier, and then it actually comes to fruition and it ends up happening. The next term that you're going to see happening in this story is irony. Isn't it ironic? A very famous song by Alanis Morissette that we'll actually study later this year. But irony is when the opposite of what you expect actually happens. So the image I have here for you, to me, this is one of the best ones ever. It is literally a marquee sign that I have seen out there in the real world where they advertise, always open, closed. It's the opposite of what you expect. That's irony. And then finally, the last literary term that we're going to talk about is something called mood. You hear people say things about being in a good mood or a bad mood, but when you talk about mood of literature, you're really talking about the feel, the emotion that the author is trying to create. It's that moment when you go to the movie and the hair on the back of your neck stands up because something creepy is happening. And sometimes mood is created by something as simple as music. Sometimes it's created by something as simple as suspense, those sorts of things. But these 6 literary terms are terms that S.E. Hinton uses all over this novel, and they are things that as you begin reading it and annotating it, what I need you to be looking for as we make our way through it, okay? That reading and annotation of that novel is going to begin tomorrow. I will be pushing out to you a very specific annotation guide for our reading schedule. We will roughly tackle 1 to 2 chapters every day. We'll read them, we'll talk about them, you'll do some work with them. And yes, you can see at the bottom of the page, the novel The Outsiders, it actually was made into a movie, a 1980s kind of movie, and we will watch it someday, I promise you. But I need you guys to make a pact with me and don't think that you can just watch the movie and know everything you need to know about the book, because like all movies made off of books, they are never, ever, ever as good as the actual book. And promise me, I promise you, this book you will find to be really, really good. Okay? There's a little hidden message in the smoke of Ponyboy's cigarette. You'll understand that message when we get to that part of the book. But I hope you guys are going to enjoy it. I look so forward to reading this book with you and teaching you all the really cool things that S.E. Hinton does in The Outsiders.